And on the day called Sunday, Helios, all who live in cities or in the country gathered together to one place. And the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. And then, when the reader has ceased, the president, that's the ruler most probably referring to the bishop, verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things.
Yeah, so some things Justin doesn't tell us. He doesn't tell us where they would gather. They would gather, from the city or from the country. They would assemble on the Lord's Day for worship. But were they meeting outdoors or in a believer's home? Justin doesn't say. One thing I think that's interesting here is Justin says that a reader will read from the writings of the prophets or the memoirs of the apostles, which in the previous chapter he referred to as the Gospels, which I think refer to the Old Testament scriptures and the Gospels. And that he makes a distinction between the reader and the president. The reader would read the text, and then the president, which could refer to the bishop, the minister, would give an exposition of the text. He would give the sermon. So there are examples of that, I think, in the New Testament. Acts chapter 13, verse 15, for example, says that the law and the prophets, when they were read, Paul then was invited to come and give the sermon. So someone else read the law and the prophets, and then Paul came and gave an exposition. He gave a sermon. There's a phrase here in this paragraph that you read that I think is very important. It says that the reader would read as long as time permits. Now that I think is very clear in showing us that in Justin's day, there was no fixed lectionary. There was no set pericopes that were to be read each Sunday, just as long as time permits. So it could vary from place to place. And so the difference between lectionaries or lectio selecta and a lectio continua. We don't have to explain all of this now, but simply I'll put it this way. In Justin's day, the books of the Bible, the Old Testament prophets and the Gospels were read on a lectio continua. So just section by section, chapter by chapter. I know there were no chapters in Justin's day, but you know what I mean. Section by section, he would go through each one. They would go through each one, and each one would be preached. And the next Sunday, they would pick it up where they left off the previous Sunday until they had cycled through the whole of the book. And that's the pattern that the earliest Christians would have adopted from synagogue services on the Sabbath. From ancient times, James says in the book of Acts, chapter 15, from ancient generations, Moses has had in every city those who preach him, since he has read in the synagogues every Sabbath. And so the law was read in the synagogues every Sabbath day on a lectio continua. And the prophets were also read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. Paul says that in Acts chapter 13, Acts 13, verse 27.
But were there sermons on both, or some of these dumb readings?
Okay, so dumb reading, I probably should explain what you mean by that. A dumb reading is a reading that's not followed by comment, right? So a mute reading is another way of putting that.
I like saying dumb because that's how you taught me. So this is something my kids would say. We're going to have to do this dumb reading. Sit down, kids. We're doing family worship now. Shut your mouths.
So in the synagogue, the Torah, you had two readings. There's the law and the prophets. The law, the Torah, and then the prophets, the Haftarah, which simply means after the law. The law was read on a lectio continua. That was the sermon text. The prophets were not read on a lectio continua, but were selected readings that corresponded to the reading of the law. So there was the primary text that was read from the Torah, and then there was a subordinate text read from the prophets. And we don't just mean Isaiah through Malachi, but we mean the historical books too, which would be categorized as the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. The text chosen from the prophet was meant to be the key to unlock the meaning of the Torah. So it was a subordinate text used used to aid the preacher in interpreting Torah reading. So that was the primary text. And so I forgot the question you asked, but
Well, I wondered, because if there's two readings, an Old and a New Testament, then usually the pattern was Old Testament reading, New Testament reading, sermon. My question is, what's the sermon about?
Okay, that's a good question. So Justin says, and I don't remember the preposition he uses, but the English translation that we have says that the Old Testament prophets were read, or the memoirs of the apostles. So it's an either or. I think it could even be translated of both and. There were readings from the Old Testament, readings from the New Testament. And it appears to be the case, though it's not explicit in Justin, it does seem to be the case in other documents, that the primary text for the sermons would have been from the New Testament reading. Now, by the time you get to the 4th century, you might look at a document, for example, referred to as the Apostolic Constitutions, which is a later liturgy, a much later liturgy. You have 4 readings every service of worship. You have the Law and the Prophets, 2 Old Testament readings. Then you have an epistle reading from the New Testament and a gospel reading. The gospel reading is the last reading, and the sermons are based on the gospel that is read. And the other readings, the 2 Old Testament readings and the epistle, are chosen to complement the main text, which is the gospel reading. Now, that is eventually truncated a bit to include 1 Old Testament reading, an epistle reading, and a gospel reading. And there you have your basic lectionary structure, right? That's what in lectionaries that have come down to us in our day, that's the basic structure you have. You have an Old Testament lesson, epistle lesson, and the gospel lesson, and the sermon is supposed to be on the gospel. And those other subordinate texts are related to the gospel text and provide other data from Scripture by which we interpret them. Scripture interprets Scripture, right? That's the principle at play. So Justin's just not very clear on it. He doesn't say exactly what the exposition is based on, if it's based on the Old Testament text or the New Testament text. And he doesn't even say really if it's one or the other. It could be Old Testament one time or New Testament another time. It's just not that clear in Justin's writings.